Hello and welcome to the Stuw, a podcast where we explore a variety of topics about ministry, sometimes youth, sometimes adults, sometimes just the church in general, life, philosophy, and theology. By now, hopefully you know the drill, you know what's up. We've had a few subscribers on the Spotify. We've got 19 so far. That's good to hear. And we've got people that listen on Subsplash, which is our app, the church app, and on YouTube. And I don't know the analytics of iTunes or the Google Play, so if you listen to those, if you listen to the iTunes or the Google Play, I'd love to hear from you, see how you are listening, and be able to just understand how we can best reach people, because this is not just a podcast for youth, as some might think because I'm a youth pastor doing it. This is for as many people in the church as possible, for those of you who like to listen to podcasts. I know some people don't even like to listen to podcasts, which is fine. If you haven't listened to last week's podcast, I really hope that you do. I think it's by far the most important one that I've done so far. Perhaps there will be more important ones in the future, but it's important not just because, and obviously not because I said anything that was of value, but because it was about the gospel and how life really ought to be handled in the church, and how we can address social issues. And so we're going to capitalize a little bit on last week. I'm going to look a little bit more in depth this week. It's the first Tuesday. I record these on Tuesday. I release them on Wednesday. So last week was the fifth Tuesday of the month, and I was able to record something about the critical theory and the cultural Marxism and intersectionality. Again, if you haven't listened to it, I encourage you to give it a listen on Spotify, Apple, all over the place. You can find it on YouTube as well. Just give it a listen. It's about the new gospel, recognizing the new gospel, and share it with people too, because I think it's important that people start to hear these things. If you feel like there's somebody who's struggled in this area, and that podcast was helpful to you, I encourage you to share it with them as well. But after I addressed it last week, there was something still just kind of hanging on this week that I couldn't get past. And as I was trying to think about what I should talk about this week, because this week is supposed to be kind of a youth culture resource podcast this week, I started thinking and realizing that part of what was hanging on to me was addressing the fact that there are so many young people, I'm talking Gen Z, 25 years of age and younger, falling for this sort of Slacktivism. That's not my term. Someone else coined it, but I thought it was hilarious. Slacktivism. And slacktivism is generally, this is what it is. It's an activism that is behind the screen of a computer. You don't have to actually get out and do anything to affect actual social change. But what you do is you post a black square on Instagram, or you talk about in a long post on Facebook about how you are a benefiter of white privilege, and you want people to know that you are on their side. You are an ally right now. It's this slacktivism, not actually having to go out and do anything, still working your job, still hanging around the same group of friends, still going to the same church. So you're not actually doing anything. Maybe you went to one of the protests or something. But mostly you just kind of sit at home and say, yeah, right on. So it's this slacktivism. It's the people who say we live on stolen land, but then when pushed and say, well, if you are so broken up about that, why don't you donate your apartment, your house to Native American people? Why don't you live on the streets? Why don't you go back to Europe because you immigrated here from Europe, and your parents did in the 40s or in the 1800s, and since they were beneficiaries of the stolen land, put your money where your mouth is and do something about it. Donate whatever you have to Native Americans and move back. Well, they're not going to do that, but they'll tell you that you need to. They'll tell you that you need to. They'll tell you that you need to pay for reparations and do all sorts of things. That's this slacktivism. So the question I had in my mind was, why do so many young people, especially young people, and if you're a parent or a grandparent listening to this right now, this is very important. Why are so many young people especially vulnerable to falling prey to this sort of activism and these sort of causes, and especially being wedded with causes that are in reality anti-Christian, anti-gospel, anti-personal responsibility? What do the cultural Marxists have that we don't in evangelical circles that have captured the minds and the hearts of the young people in our culture today. And because of that, and I firmly believe this, because the young people are so captivated by these movements, the church starts to sacrifice doctrine. I preached a sermon on Sunday about how we can't sacrifice doctrine because of culture. I see our churches doing it right now, especially in this movement, sacrificing doctrine to remain culturally relevant, and that's when you start to see the gospel lose its potency, because it becomes a gospel of man rather than a gospel of God. It becomes a club to play sports in rather than a body of Christ to belong to. So what do the cultural Marxists have that we don't? And you might be listening to this and wondering what this has to do with you and your family. After all, you homeschool, the educational system isn't getting to them, you limit social media so they aren't running into such nonsense on social media, but they will. And the pressure of the woke scolds and the leftist Marxists right now is unrelenting. They will run into this pressure eventually, and they'll either face it head on or they will buckle underneath it. And that is the goal, is to get people to buckle. That's the goal of the cancel culture, is to cajole and club people, not just cajole, club people over the head so that they will come to your side, your way of thinking. It reminds me of how Islam first spread. And that was violence of submission to Islam or death. And people, well, if I'm going to choose between the two, I'm going to choose submission to Islam. This is the religion of wokeness is the same thing. It is submission to our ideology, submission to the social gospel, submission to the culture of critical theory and cultural Marxism, or we will ruin your life. We will dox you, which is, if you don't know what doxing is, it's taking your online persona and somebody revealing who you are really as a person, and sending out your telephone number or your address, all sorts of things, or where you go to church. I saw a video this past week of Black Lives Matter protesters screaming at people that were just walking into church with a megaphone, screaming at their faces. So, in conjunction with being aware of the new gospels that are among us, and that I spoke about last week, this week I thought it would be good to get into 5 reasons why young people, especially and specifically, fall victim to these causes, and what we can do as Christians, as conservative evangelical Christians, to combat those reasons. Now these are my guesses for the most part. I haven't looked at a ton of research. I've read some articles. I've looked at some reasoning. I've perused social media to kind of see and find and get a sense for where this is at. I've had almost 15 years in youth ministry and that culture, seeing people get drawn into that. And so these are kind of my personal observations. So hopefully these are based in reality and fact, but generally this is what I have seen. So I'm going to give you the top 5 of the reasons I think kids fall into these causes and fall prey to them. And this is not new. I don't think this is new. I think this happened in the 60s, in the 70s. This happened in the 90s. It's happening right now. So I think this is relatively true across generations, but it's just louder now because of social media. That's a huge aspect of it. So the first reason, I think, is because there's this false sense of morality. Kids are particularly susceptible to moral-sounding language without looking at the actual results of the system. They are told that inequality is bad, and they say, yeah, equal sounds good. And they're told that unfairness is bad. Like, well, yeah, that's right. I don't like it when I'm treated unfairly. And so when they say, yeah, so there are poor people in the world, and isn't that unfair? And they go, yeah, that is unfair. That is unjust. Well, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. You have to look at the truth of the situation. Now, poverty is not a good thing. It's not something we should aspire to necessarily, but it isn't evil either. In fact, Jesus seems to indicate it is easier for the person that is impoverished to understand their need for God than it is for the person that is wealthy. So kids are obsessed with fairness. And how many times have you heard a kid say, "That's not fair"? What? They don't say that's unjust. They say that's not fair. And kids are obsessed with this idea of fairness because we use fairness and justice as interchangeable in our culture. Fairness and justice are not the same thing. In some cases, fairness can be the enemy of justice depending on how it's used. Fairness in starting point is all well and good. We all got to start at the same line, but fairness in outcome is different. And fairness is, generally speaking, used regardless of what someone has earned. They're needed to be treated fairly because they're a human being. And when we equate it to justice, that just needs to be fair and right, but it isn't fairness. Because not everybody gets the same penalty because it's an individual situation, individual justice. Fairness is a bigger thing. It's the 30,000-foot view. I want to be treated like everybody else. Well, we want to be treated like everybody else until we are treated like everybody else, and then we want special treatment. Maybe we'll get into that sometime soon. But it's this idea that morality can be co-opted by different systems. So kids grow up in a Christian household hearing that we should love people, we should care about people, we should care about the oppressed, we should fight oppressors, we should love people unconditionally, and they hear all of these terms. And so when they look into culture, that's the framework with which they're thinking. Those terms mean something different in pagan culture, especially in cultural Marxism, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Love is a good quality. Caring for those who are oppressed is a good quality. Caring for others' emotions is actually a good quality. Being sad that you hurt someone's feelings is a good thing. However, caring about how others feel at the expense of truth is not a good thing. Love must be based on reality. And that's something that's hard for kids to get across. My 2-year-old right now, if I take something away from her because it's not good for her, says, "Daddy, you hurt my feelings." Those emotions aren't based on reality. I hurt her feelings because I was actually doing something that was good for her, not something that was bad for her. So while she thought it was unfair, it actually was just. See how there's a difference there? So for instance, I'm going to go through the cause du jour, right? Black Lives Matter. Not just the phrase, because I agree with the phrase, and I've said that a lot. That I agree with the phrase Black Lives Matter. I think it's fine to use that phrase, but I do not and will not support the organization, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I'm going to go through a bit of the Black Lives Matter organization's belief section on their website. And I want us to think about how a young person obsessed with fairness and obsessed with caring for those that have been told they are oppressed might respond to some of these statements. And I'm only going to be able to do a few of them because of time, but maybe some other time I can go through the whole thing. If you go to their website, blacklivesmatter.com, and you click on the What We Believe, there's a lot on there that seems innocuous or even good to the casual observer. However, remember last week's podcast about critical theory, intersectionality, cultural Marxism? Because according to that framework, the language changes greatly. And we'll get into a few lines here. I'm just going to pull out a few lines and address what they are actually saying in these few lines. So here's one. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence. Okay, on its face, this says that they care deeply about making a world that is fair to both cisgendered, and that's people that identify as the gender that they were born in, and transgender people, especially black transgenders. That's what it seems like it's saying on its face. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad. While we would say somebody can't, who is a man can't become a woman, we could empathize with the person struggling with that and say, yeah, we should treat them fairly and lovingly. They should be able to make a living. They should be able to pursue happiness in our culture and in our lives. I can get behind that. It doesn't sound too bad, but if we dig deeper and use that critical theory framework we set up last week, in the eyes of cultural Marxism and critical theory, privilege is a euphemism for oppressor. So if you don't read this with Marxist thought in mind, you might be tempted to see a nonviolent group that is generally concerned with society treating everyone the same regardless of mental issues. Just fairness. They just want fairness, right? But that's not what it's saying. That is not what it's saying. This is what it's saying. It's saying that cisgendered, people who identify with the gender that they were born with, that this privilege must be dismantled. In other words, destroyed. What does that mean? The oppressor must be overthrown. We must change our culture, not simply to afford the same care and opportunities in the world between cisgender and transgender people, but we must defeat those that would not engage in delusion and lift those who have a real mental issue into a protected space. the cisgender, the transgender, they are the oppressed. They must be venerated. They must be made better than those evil cisgender types, especially those cisgender types that are unapologetically so. So if you're a white cisgender male, you are part of the problem. You must be overthrown because your whiteness has oppressed and threatened especially black trans people. Never mind the fact that you might think and believe that the best thing you can do for these people is to not engage in the delusion in the mind that a woman can become a man or a man can become a woman, but to tell them the truth in love and to guide them into care. Forget about that. They are oppressed. You are the oppressor. You must be dealt with. See, the problem here is that underneath the veneer of care for an individual, and I do believe we should care deeply for individuals that are transgender, there becomes a proposed restructuring of what is good and what is not good. Not only should black trans folk be cared for, they ought to be uplifted. They ought not to be challenged. They are part of a protected class. And really, this is a soft bigotry of low expectations to say that black cisgendered people must be uplifted because they can't handle themselves. It's like, well, they can't have a conversation. You expect me to have they can't have a conversation about the issue? And as we found out last week, violence, so what it says, what it says is that they're disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence. It's important to understand the definition of those words. As we found out last week, violence is not in and of itself physical violence in this cultural Marxist thought. Violence is any action taken in opposition to the favored or oppressed party. In other words, the sentence here isn't simply about physical violence. Speech that doesn't align with their reality is also considered violence, especially if it is coming from a cisgendered person, because they are part of the oppressor class. So telling a black trans woman that they are in fact a biological male, and that they are and that their option to help them is to help them in that struggle is oppressive, and it's a violent act. Any offer to help them try to figure that out, any offer to talk through that with them is an oppressive and violent act made on the shoulders of cisgender white privilege. And that's just one line from the What We Believe page. I'll look at more, but if you're interested, sometime I could break down the entire What We Believe page according to this social critical theory framework. Let me know in the comments on YouTube, via email, josh@crosspointbible.org, if that's something you would like. Okay. And the last section of their What We Believe page I'll be looking at is this, and I'm running up against the clock here, obviously, is they say this: we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages, in quotations, that collectively are care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Okay, there's a ton in there, but I'm going to focus on a few things. Again, the framework of cultural Marxist thought. Western values are oppressive values. A young person brought up in the church might innocently read this and say, oh, they don't want any child to be left behind without a home. That's good. We shouldn't demonize single parenthood. And I support that. We shouldn't demonize single parenthood. We should do what we can to help the single mother, the single father. But this is blatantly anti-family. It is not just saying we should help the single parent. It is being made to say that the nuclear family, mom, dad, kids, is not only unwanted, but unneeded, and that a community of people can raise families and should raise families together. This is blatantly anti-family. It's blatantly anti-God's structure and God's structure for humanity to be in the nuclear family. And notice the number one member of the family that is left out of this line is the father. If you look up, it says mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. That's because above that line, there's also a demonization of what they call patriarchy, and that's not simply chauvinism. That's any structure in which a man is seen as assuming a role of responsibility or leadership in a family. The entire premise of this morality is emotion-based. It is to bring up supposed oppressed groups and assign virtue to them. The goal of movements like this is to find individual instances of injustice and move straight from addressing individuals to addressing an entire system. Thus, individual responsibility is no longer an issue. The system is the problem. This is a morality based on fear, not fact. Love based on group fairness and not individual justice. This is not biblical. We combat this by doing this. To use their term, we dismantle arguments against designed to generate emotive responses by majoring on objective morality. For instance, the reminder we had last week that truth and love are inextricably linked and that there is only one truth. The goal is to sit down with our kids and not to say, no, we're conservatives here, and this is how conservatives think. This is how you ought to think. No, again, that reeks of oppression. They're seeing this oppressor narrative, and you're saying, oh, you're trying to oppress me by telling me what conservatives think. The answer could be, hey, I care a lot about the transgender community. I love them all individually as made in God's image, and that love is the reason why I cannot go along with this narrative that a man can become a woman and a woman can become a man. It breaks my heart that they feel that I hate them, but the truth is the exact opposite. I love them enough to tell them the truth. And if I wasn't honest with them, and I wasn't honest with Scripture, that would mean I would be hating them. And they are broken people just like me. I am just as broken as they are, and that's the only way I came to Christ and to know the truth about myself. Okay, I can talk about that for hours, and I've gotten through only one point here. We're at the 21-minute mark, so let's get through points 2 through 5. The other reason that young people fall to this line, to these causes sometimes, is that they want to be a part of something. That's number 2. There are many young people that want to feel important. They want to be embraced. They want to embrace a cause that can help people. However, they aren't particularly seasoned enough in life to understand which causes are real and which are fake, which are borrowed from misused statistics. They find the loudest cause with the most outrage for a few reasons. 1, they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And 2, the recognition that comes with a popular movement feels good. To be outraged together feels great. Everyone wants to feel special. We want to be individualistic enough to say we're different, but we want to be the same enough to fit in. It's like the movie Incredibles when he's giving everyone superpowers. He wants to capitalize on that, and he says, and then when everyone is super, no one is. It's the same thing. When we're all unique, no one will be. So how do we fight this? I think the problem comes when we do fight it. We rail against movements that they are leaning towards and alienates them. Instead, maybe we need to ask what they find so appealing about it. What is the driving force? And then offer an alternative way of understanding the situation, offer something even better. Abortion. Why is that evil and wrong? Give them that cause. Adoption. Why is that good and necessary and scripturally based? Give them that cause. The gospel itself. Refocus from social to eternal. Number 3, they need or feel the need to rebel. And we all know that we are susceptible to that at that age. And we're susceptible to it our whole lives. It just didn't seem so pervasive because of social media. Kids rebel, they just do, either silently or actively, they want to rebel. So how do we fight this? As parents and churches, it is hard. The rebellion comes from deep down, and the more you address it, the more it feels like they're slipping through your fingers. So that said, a gentle reminder that your disagreement with them on social issues and even religious issues could never change the way you love them will give them reason to trust you with conversation eventually. I saw a video recently of Josh McDowell's son. Someone asked him, what would you do if your son came out as gay? And he said, I would tell my son, I love you, and no choice you could make would ever change that. He didn't go straight to, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? No, it's just remember that I love you. That's an important thing to keep kneeling, because what happens on the left is they eat their own. They only love you insofar as you continue to play the company line. If you treat your kids the same way, they're going to feel alienated by you, just as they're going to eventually feel alienated by the left because they said something wrong on Twitter. Somebody will dig up an old tweet they had from 4 years ago, and they can come back to you because you proved to them that you would love them no matter what. Number 4, and that's the long play, obviously, and it's hard, it's difficult, it's really hard to do, and I'll just leave that there. So number 4, frankly, we've avoided conversations, and this one is on us. We've refused to talk about issues that are difficult. Instead, we rant and rave about the stupidity of the other side. We haven't left room for dialogue. There isn't a meaningful understanding of why the nuclear family is important, just that it is important, or why church is important, just that it is important, and that's what we do. Address those things. Address what racism is and what it isn't. Give your reasons for agreeing with Black Lives Matter, as a phrase and not as an organization. Challenge their notions of right and wrong, ask questions, use scripture to bolster points, use history as an example. Teach your kids. In other words, don't avoid difficult topics, embrace them, and don't expect that your kids are going to fall lockstep with the things that you're going to say, because sometimes they might not. Hopefully, they do if it's based in truth and based in the Word of God. Teaching your kids to think critically and think for themselves and be willing to change your mind is very important. It reminds me of another thing Sean McDowell said in that video. He said when he went to his father, Josh McDowell, and said, "I don't know if I believe in God anymore," his father said, "I trust that I brought you up to trust and to look after truth. And know as long as you pursue truth, Sean, I will be right there with you." So that's a good response to that as well. Last but not least, number 5, again, we're running up against it. There's no convincing alternative. There's no convincing alternative narrative. And let's be honest, to young people, outrage can often equate to rightness, morality, this outrage culture. It can equal to that. And the positive narrative spun of cultural upheaval in the midst of social change in our schools provides that when we see that upheaval in the name of a cause, that might be why we buy hook, line, and sinker in with the cause. Because, people marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and people are marching now, I need to be a part of this. I would encourage all of us to not be ignorant of current narratives that are being spun and try to understand this. If you are so looking into counterculture as a teen, give them options to do that. The March for Life, talk about that. This is also a reason why conservatism politically actually is starting to make a little bit of a move, because when you are able to give the truth in a convincing manner, people start to go, oh, I could be wrong about that, because kids don't want to feel stupid. So people like Thomas Sowell, Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, and so many different. And I'm not saying I agree with all of them, but they have Charlie Kirk. They have so well articulated their belief style that kids start to go, oh, well, this is a convincing alternative narrative. Give them that and say, just have you considered this? Be willing to read a book that they're going to give you, and then give them a book from the opposite side and say, hey, let's talk about where we're at here. Let's talk about these two different sides, and maybe we can come to an understanding, and that will lead them to the truth. Offer them that truth. Offer them the truth narrative, not just a simple narrative. And you offer that on a silver platter, an opportunity to discuss. Maybe kids will take you up on that. Maybe they won't. I could talk about this for hours. Unfortunately, out of time. Let me know if you want to understand a little bit more about this, if you want more conversation in this regard, if this discussion was too short, although I doubt it. If you have more questions or observations, please just let me know. Josh@crosspointbible.org. I'd love to interact and entertain more discussions on this topic in the near future. And as always, the Stuw is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play Music, YouTube, our church website, and app. Please like, rate, subscribe, share if you like the content, so that we can get more word out there, and share across the church, because maybe not everybody in the church knows what's going on here. So we'd love to see that and love to hear from you. We will see you in the Stuw next week.